By the time Amelia realized why no one would call her back after interviews, her confidence had already been chipped away by silence. Resume vanished into nothing. Polite smiles ended with closed doors, and whispered judgments followed her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. What Amelia didn't know, what she never imagined, was that the people who were supposed to protect her had been quietly destroying her reputation for years. Her parents had told every potential employer the same lie. She's a thief. Don't trust her. Don't trust. What they didn't account for was Grandma Eleanor, sharp-minded, quietly powerful, and always 3 steps ahead. Amelia learned very early that being quiet was safer than being right. In the small, neatly kept house where she grew up, silence was praised as maturity and questions were treated like accusations. Her father, Richard, believed children were meant to obey first and understand later, if at all. He carried himself like a judge, even at the dinner table, measuring tone, posture, gratitude. Her mother, Lydia, managed the household with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, the kind that looked warm to outsiders but felt sharp up close. Amelia tried endlessly to be the daughter they wanted. Straight A's, folded clothes, chores done before being asked. But perfection never bought her trust. The smallest mishap, a missing bracelet, money miscounted after groceries, a drawer left open, was enough for Lydia's eyes to slide toward Amelia, already certain. Richard never asked what happened. He asked why Amelia would do such a thing, and the question itself carried the verdict. Explanations sounded like excuses in that house, and Amelia learned that the fastest way to end an interrogation was to nod and accept blame she didn't understand. Her younger sister, Sophie, was everything Amelia wasn't allowed to be. Loud, impulsive, charmingly careless. When Sophie broke something, it was an accident. When Amelia did, it was a reflection of her character. Sophie cried and was comforted. Amelia stayed composed and was suspected. Over time, even Sophie began to believe the story the family told about Amelia. She would glance sideways when their parents accused Amelia, half curious, half convinced, and never once said, "It wasn't her." Amelia noticed how blame flowed downhill, how it always landed on her because she carried it quietly. Teachers praised her responsibility, neighbors complimented her politeness, relatives called her the serious one, and none of them saw how that seriousness was built from caution, from knowing that any joy she showed could later be used against her. She became careful with her hands, her words, her expressions, terrified of leaving behind evidence for an accusation she could never disprove. What hurt most wasn't the punishment. It was the certainty with which her parents believed the worst version of her without hesitation. Lydia would sigh dramatically, telling relatives that Amelia had a problem with honesty, while Richard framed it as concern, warning that Amelia needed discipline before life teaches her harsher lessons. Those words followed Amelia through adolescence like a stain she couldn't scrub out. She stopped asking for new clothes, stopped touching things that weren't explicitly hers, stopped defending herself because defense only made them dig in deeper. In her own home, she became a guest under suspicion, someone who had to earn the right to exist without being monitored. Amelia didn't yet understand that repeated lies, when spoken by authority, harden into truth for everyone listening, including the person they are about. She only knew that no matter how carefully she lived, no matter how good she tried to be, there was always an invisible line she had already crossed, a version of herself already decided, one that she was expected to live up to whether she wanted to or not. By the time Amelia graduated, she believed hard work was supposed to be loud enough to drown out doubt. She had built her resume carefully, stacking internships, volunteer work, and academic achievements like proof against an accusation no one outside her family had ever spoken aloud. University had been her refuge, a place where results mattered more than reputation, where professors evaluated her by deadlines met and ideas defended rather than suspicion. She graduated near the top of her class, her name printed cleanly on certificates that felt like a fresh start. Amelia entered the job market with cautious hope, rehearsing answers, tailoring cover letters, ironing clothes late into the night. Interviews went smoothly, sometimes exceptionally well. Recruiters smiled, nodded, praised her clarity and work ethic. She walked out of office buildings, imagining herself inside them. already adjusting to new routines, already planning how independence would feel. Then days passed. Emails stayed unanswered. Calls never came. Polite follow ups were met with silence or vague rejections that explained nothing. At first, Amelia assumed it was competition, timing, bad luck. She told herself this was normal, that persistence was the key, that rejection was part of the process. As the pattern repeated, confusion crept in. Some employers who had seemed enthusiastic suddenly withdrew offers without explanation. Others cut interviews short after reference checks, their tones subtly colder, their eyes avoiding hers. Amelia replayed conversations in her head, dissecting every sentence she had spoken, every gesture she had made, convinced she must be missing something obvious. She asked career counselors to review her resume, practiced mock interviews, adjusted her approach. Nothing changed. What unsettled her most was how abrupt the shift always was, how promise turned into distance overnight, as if an invisible switch had been flipped behind closed doors. She began to sense that whatever was wrong had nothing to do with her skills. It felt personal in a way she couldn't locate, like being judged for a crime she didn't know she'd been charged with. Each rejection chipped away at the confidence she had fought to rebuild after leaving home, reviving the old, familiar feeling that she was fundamentally untrustworthy without understanding why. Unbeknownst to Amelia, the sabotage had already been woven neatly into her life. Lydia framed her actions as maternal concern, calling employers under the guise of clarification, lowering her voice as if sharing a burden. She warned them gently, insistently, that Amelia had a history of dishonesty and that it would be irresponsible not to mention it. Richard followed up when asked, his tone authoritative, confirming the story with the weight of a parent's credibility. He didn't raise his voice or sound angry. He sounded reasonable, regretful, convincing. Together, they painted Amelia as a liability disguised as competence, someone polished on the surface but dangerous underneath. Employers, wary of risk, listened. Background checks don't always uncover family narratives, but references do, and Amelia never imagined that the people listed as emergency contacts would become the quietest obstacles in her path. At home, the irony was suffocating. Lydia lamented Amelia's unemployment while tightening her grip, asking invasive questions about interviews, suggesting Amelia lower her expectations, hinting that maybe this was the consequence of earlier behavior. Richard lectured her about accountability, about how trust once broken was difficult to restore, never acknowledging that Amelia had never been given the chance to earn it in the first place. Sophie, watching from the sidelines, absorbed the implication that Amelia's failure was deserved, reinforcing the family myth through silence. Amelia began to doubt her own memories, wondering if she had done something wrong and simply erased it to survive. The job market became a mirror reflecting her parents' version of her back at her, confirming fears she had spent years trying to bury, leaving her trapped between ambition and an invisible wall she couldn't yet see or name. Grandma Eleanor had always existed slightly outside the gravity of the household, close enough to observe, but distant enough not to be swallowed by its rules. She visited often, sat quietly in the living room with her knitting or a book, and listened far more than anyone realized. While Lydia performed warmth and Richard projected authority, Eleanor watched the way conversations tilted, how accusations landed predictably on Amelia, how explanations were never truly heard. She noticed how Amelia's shoulders tightened when her name was called, how her hands folded instinctively in her lap as if preparing for judgment. Eleanor had lived long enough to recognize patterns masquerading as discipline and cruelty disguised as concern. She didn't challenge Richard directly. She knew men like him sharpened themselves in opposition, but she never joined the chorus either. When Lydia sighed about Amelia's tendencies, Eleanor would hum non-committally, her silence unsettling in a room that relied on agreement to function. Unlike the others, Eleanor asked questions that weren't accusations. She asked Amelia what she was studying, what books she liked, what she wanted her life to look like beyond the walls of that house. When Amelia answered hesitantly, unused to being asked without consequence, Eleanor listened as if every word mattered. Over time, Amelia began to talk more freely with her grandmother, not about the accusations directly, but about the exhaustion of always being careful, the strange way opportunities slipped through her fingers, the feeling of being watched even when she had nothing to hide. Eleanor never interrupted, never corrected, never rushed to reassure. She stored details away quietly, the way someone does when they sense the truth will need structure someday. What Amelia mistook for gentle distraction was, in reality, attentive preparation. Eleanor had lost her own illusions about family decades earlier. She had seen how stories could be weaponized, how repetition could turn fiction into fact, how authority could drown out innocence. When she heard Lydia on the phone one afternoon, her voice lowered, her words carefully chosen. "I just think you should know, as a mother, I wouldn't forgive myself if something happened." Eleanor didn't confront her. She wrote down the date instead. When Richard later made a similar call, pacing the kitchen, reinforcing the same narrative with a practiced gravity, Eleanor noted the time, the number dialed, the phrasing. She didn't yet know how far the damage would spread, but she knew enough to start documenting it. While the family assumed she was dozing in her chair, Eleanor was mapping a quiet pattern of betrayal. Her preparation was methodical, almost invisible. She saved voicemails Lydia didn't realize she had left on speaker. She kept copies of emails forwarded to shared family accounts. She spoke discreetly to an old friend who worked in human resources, asking careful, hypothetical questions about references and liability. She learned which words raised red flags, which accusations lingered longest in an employer's mind. Eleanor understood that truth alone was not enough. It needed proof, context, and timing. She began to adjust her will, not out of spite, but strategy, creating contingencies designed to give Amelia leverage instead of sympathy. Independence, Eleanor believed, was the most effective form of protection, and she intended to give Amelia the tools her parents had deliberately withheld. What hurt Eleanor most was not just the lie, but the patience with which it was told. Richard and Lydia believed they were shaping Amelia, correcting her, keeping her safe, never considering that control and care were not the same thing. Eleanor saw how Amelia's confidence thinned with each passing year, how her voice softened, how she apologized for things that required no apology. She saw brilliance dulled by constant self-surveillance, potential compressed into compliance. That kind of damage, Eleanor knew, didn't heal on its own. It required interruption. It required evidence strong enough to fracture the narrative everyone had accepted. So she waited, collected, and prepared, not because she doubted Amelia's strength, but because she knew that strength should never have to fight alone. Daniel Reyes entered Amelia's life without drama, without suspicion, and without the instinct to measure her against an invisible charge sheet. They met through a professional networking event she had nearly skipped, convinced it would end like all the others, with polite conversation leading nowhere. Daniel was calm in a way that felt unforced, attentive without being invasive, and he listened to Amelia as if her words were complete on their own, not something to be weighed for hidden meaning. He asked about her interests before her credentials, about her values before her goals, and that alone unsettled her more than any rejection ever had. Amelia found herself answering cautiously at first, bracing for judgment that never came. Daniel didn't interrupt, didn't test her answers, didn't look for inconsistencies. When he smiled, it wasn't evaluative, it was present. That difference lodged somewhere deep in Amelia's chest, unfamiliar and quietly disarming. As their relationship grew, Amelia realized how much of herself she had been editing for years. With Daniel, there was no need to rehearse explanations or preempt accusations. She didn't have to over-clarify or justify small mistakes. The first time she misplaced her phone in his apartment, panic surged automatically, an old reflex, and she began apologizing before she had even started looking for it. Daniel blinked, confused, and handed it to her from the coffee table, asking gently why she was so upset. Amelia laughed it off, embarrassed, but the moment stayed with him. He noticed how often she doubted praise, how she deflected compliments as if they were traps, how she hesitated before celebrating even minor successes. These weren't habits formed overnight, and Daniel, trained by years of work in cybersecurity and behavioral analysis, recognized patterns the way others recognized faces. Something in Amelia's past had taught her that trust was conditional and easily revoked. When Amelia finally spoke about her family, it wasn't a dramatic confession, but a fragmented explanation, delivered in pieces over time. She described her parents' strictness, the constant suspicion, the way blame always seemed to land on her. She framed it carefully, minimizing her own pain, afraid of sounding bitter or unfair. Daniel didn't rush to conclusions, but he listened with focused attention, asking questions that weren't accusatory but clarifying. He wanted timelines, specifics, patterns, not to challenge her story, but to understand its shape. When she mentioned her job search and the inexplicable rejections, Daniel's expression changed. Subtly, not to doubt, but to curiosity sharpened by concern, he asked who her references were, who might be contacted informally, how information about her might be traveling without her knowledge. Amelia hadn't considered those questions before. The possibility that something external was interfering with her career felt both terrifying and relieving. Daniel didn't promise to fix anything. He didn't frame himself as a rescuer. Instead, he approached the situation the way he approached any complex system breach, methodically, quietly, without alerting the source. He suggested documenting interactions, saving emails, noting dates and responses. He explained how reputational damage worked in professional circles, how a single trusted voice could outweigh dozens of qualifications. Amelia listened, a knot forming in her stomach as old memories aligned with new explanations. The idea that her parents might be involved felt disloyal even to consider, yet it explained too much to ignore. Daniel never pushed her to confront them, never suggested accusations without evidence. He respected her emotional boundaries even as he helped her build practical ones, reinforcing something Amelia had never been taught. That caution didn't have to mean self-erasure. Their bond deepened not through grand gestures, but through consistency. Daniel showed up when he said he would. He followed through. He treated Amelia's experiences as valid, even when they were painful to hear. In his presence, Amelia began to imagine a version of herself unburdened by inherited guilt, someone allowed to exist without constant defense. Daniel became a mirror that reflected her competence instead of her alleged flaws, and that reflection slowly rewired something inside her. For the first time, Amelia wasn't alone in questioning the narrative she had been given. She wasn't being told who she was being asked. And in that space, fragile but growing, the truth began to feel less dangerous than the silence that had protected the lie for so long. The breaking point arrived quietly, not with a dramatic argument or an explosive revelation, but with an email that ended in a single, devastating sentence. Amelia had made it through 3 rounds of interviews with a mid-sized firm that had seemed genuinely excited about her background. The hiring manager had spoken openly about growth opportunities, about trust, about long-term plans. Amelia allowed herself to imagine stability again, a future that didn't depend on her parents' approval or permission. When the rejection came, it was phrased with professional courtesy, but one line stood out, unmistakable in its implication. Concerns had been raised during the reference process that the company could not ignore. No further explanation was offered. Amelia stared at the screen for a long time, her hands trembling as old accusations echoed in her mind, suddenly no longer confined to childhood memories. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. Something was actively working against her. Instead of confronting her parents, Amelia went to the only place that had ever felt safe from assumption. Grandma Eleanor's small book-lined apartment. Eleanor didn't ask why she was there. She simply poured tea and waited. When Amelia finally spoke, the words came out unevenly, frustration and self-doubt tangled together. She described the pattern of interviews, the sudden reversals, the growing fear that her reputation had been poisoned without her knowledge. Eleanor listened, her expression steady, almost grim, as if the story was confirming something she had long suspected rather than surprising her. When Amelia finished, Eleanor stood without a word and crossed the room to a narrow cabinet Amelia had never seen opened before. From the bottom drawer, she retrieved a thick folder, edges worn, papers meticulously organized. She placed it on the table between them and sat down slowly, as if setting something heavy not just on the wood, but on the truth itself. Inside the folder was a history Amelia hadn't known existed. Dates, times, phone numbers, transcripts of voicemails Lydia had left when she thought no one was listening. Notes Eleanor had taken after overhearing conversations, after recognizing repeated phrasing, after realizing the same story was being told to different people. There were printed emails forwarded from shared accounts, subtle in tone but unmistakable in content, warning employers about Amelia's supposed dishonesty. One page contained a brief statement from a former hiring manager who had documented the call because it felt inappropriate, noting Lydia's insistence and Richard's confirmation. Amelia's chest tightened as she read, each line dismantling years of self-blame and replacing it with something colder and clearer. This wasn't misunderstanding, it was deliberate. Eleanor explained calmly without anger how she had noticed the pattern long before Amelia had. She spoke of patience, of knowing that confronting liars without evidence only made them more careful. She described how authority gave weight to falsehoods, how parents were often believed over children by default. Eleanor admitted she had waited longer than she wanted to, not because she doubted Amelia, but because she wanted to be sure that when the truth surfaced, it would be undeniable. She had seen too many women dismissed for speaking too early, too emotionally, without documentation. Amelia listened, tears blurring the pages in front of her, grief and relief colliding in equal measure. The lie that had shaped her life finally had a face, a structure, a paper trail. The realization was both devastating and grounding. Every unexplained rejection, every sudden shift in tone, every lecture about trust now made sense. The narrative her parents had fed her wasn't discipline or concern, it was control reinforced through reputational harm. Amelia felt anger rise, but it was a clean anger, unclouded by doubt. For the first time, she wasn't questioning her own memory or motives. The truth existed outside her feelings, documented and preserved. Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed her hand, her grip firm, steady, anchoring. Amelia wasn't crazy. She hadn't failed. She had been obstructed by the very people who insisted they were protecting her, and now the evidence sat in front of her, waiting to be used. Amelia assumed the folder was the end of it, that uncovering the truth was the final step before confrontation or collapse, but Eleanor had never believed in stopping at exposure alone. Truth, she knew, needed infrastructure. While Amelia absorbed the weight of what had been taken from her, Eleanor outlined what she had been quietly building in parallel. Years earlier, she had established a separate trust in Amelia's name, structured carefully to provide financial independence without parental oversight. It wasn't vast, but it was intentional, enough to fund relocation, legal consultation, or a period of unemployment without desperation. Eleanor had also arranged independent professional references through her network, people who knew Amelia's work firsthand and had no connection to Richard or Lydia. These were safeguards, not gifts, designed to ensure that Amelia's future wouldn't collapse the moment someone else decided to rewrite her past. Eleanor's preparation extended beyond finances. She had consulted an attorney discreetly, not to initiate immediate action, but to understand leverage, liability, and documentation standards. Every note in the folder had been formatted to meet evidentiary thresholds, every recording preserved in compliance with consent laws. She had anticipated denial, gaslighting, and revisionism, and she had planned for them with quiet precision. Amelia listened, stunned, realizing that while she had been trying to survive, Eleanor had been planning for accountability. This wasn't about revenge, it was about balance. Eleanor had lived long enough to know that unchecked narratives grow more dangerous with time, and that silence only ever benefits the people already holding power. The final layer of Eleanor's preparation was the one Amelia hadn't expected: timing. Eleanor insisted that nothing be confronted immediately. Instead, Amelia would apply again, this time with references Eleanor had vetted, contact points her parents couldn't access, and legal awareness guiding every step. The objective wasn't to prove Richard and Lydia wrong to their faces, but to prove them irrelevant to Amelia's future. Eleanor believed that independence was the most disarming response to control, that success without permission carried more weight than confrontation ever could. Amelia felt something shift as she understood the scope of what had been done for her, not out of pity, but out of belief. When Richard and Lydia eventually learned that Amelia no longer relied on them for money, approval, or access, their authority fractured. Questions they had never expected were asked by people they couldn't intimidate or dismiss. Employers followed up. Records were requested, statements were compared. Eleanor never raised her voice or accused them outright. She simply allowed the truth to circulate where lies once had. The same confidence Richard had used to condemn Amelia now worked against him, sounding rehearsed rather than credible. Lydia's concern read as manipulation under scrutiny, her carefully chosen words collapsing into pattern. Consequences didn't arrive as punishment, but as exposure, quiet and unavoidable. Amelia watched this unfold with a steadiness she didn't know she possessed. She didn't feel triumph, only clarity. The story that had defined her for so long was no longer being told by others. She had resources, allies, and proof, but more importantly, she had permission from herself to step forward without apology. Eleanor remained beside her, not directing, not shielding, simply present, her preparation complete. The future no longer felt like something that could be taken away with a phone call or a whisper. It felt earned, structured, and finally her own.